Welcome to Lesson 5 of ypww. I do not own the rights to this music. Our lesson text is coming out of Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 22 through 29. The topic is giving and the moral life. Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 22 through 29, the King James Version. Thou shalt truly tithe all the increase of thy seed, that the field bringeth forth year by year, and thou shalt eat before the Lord thy God, in the place which he shall choose to place his name there. The tithe of thy corn, of thy wine, and of thine oil, and the firstlings of thy herds, and of thy flocks, that thou mayest learn to fear the Lord thy God always. And if the way be too long for thee, so that thou art not able to carry it, or if the place be too far from thee, which the Lord thy God shall choose to set his name there, when the Lord thy God hath blessed thee, then shalt thou turn it into money, and bind up the money in thine hand, and shalt go unto the place which the Lord thy God shall choose, and thou shalt bestow that money for whatsoever thy soul lusteth after, for oxen, or for sheep, or for wine, or for strong drink, or for whatsoever thy soul desireth, and thou shalt eat there before the Lord thy God, and thou shalt rejoice, thou and thine household, and the Levite that is within thy gates. Thou shalt not forsake him, for he hath no part nor inheritance with thee. At the end of 3 years thou shalt bring forth all the tithe of thine increase the same year, and shall lay it up within thy gates. And the Levite, because he hath no part nor inheritance with thee, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow, which are within thy gates, shall come, and shall eat and be satisfied, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the work of thine hand which thou doest. The lesson aim says, to show that giving of one's resources is an important feature of the Christian moral life. The memory verse says, and the Levite, because he hath no part nor inheritance with thee, and the stranger, and the fatherless, and the widow, which are within thy gates, shall come, and shall eat and be satisfied, that the Lord thy God may bless thee in all the work of thine hand which thou doest. And that's Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 29, the King James Version. The NIV version says, so that the Levites who have no allotment or inheritance of their own, and the foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows who live in your towns may come and eat and be satisfied, and so that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of your hands. The introduction says, one of the worst things that could ever happen to saints is that they become obsessed with making money. This problem is part of a larger issue, for it brings into play the conversation about gluttony. It is possible to claim that gluttony is an insatiable appetite for intake, power, money, or sex. While we want to reduce gluttony to a problem with the intake of food, it has significance for other areas of life as well. God wants to deliver the saints from gluttony. For the sake of space, we will deal only with gluttony as it relates to material resources. The passage with which we will concern ourselves examines this issue. In it, the Lord reminds the biblical community that they should practice well-doing, beneficence, or philanthropy. Then is the sharing of items with friends as well as enemies. God wants the saints to involve themselves in activities that become a physical blessing to others. To remedy this desire to hoard and rake in things for ourselves, the Lord expects us to share what we have with others in our communities. Let's now turn our attention to a discussion of Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 22 to 29. The discussion says, Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 22 to 29, includes 5 major parts. 1. The exhortation to present tithes, and that's Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 22 and 23. A. The command to present tithes, verse 22. The items and site for the presentation of tithes, verse 23. C. The goal for presentation of tithes, verse 23. Number 2. The convertibility of the tithe, Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 24 through 26. A. The prerequisites for the conversion of tithes, verse 24. B. The purpose for the conversion of tithes, also found in verse 24. C. The rule for the conversion of tithes, verse 25. D. The transportation of money from tithes, verse 25. E. The usage of money from tithes, and that's found in verse 26. The command for the household to enjoy tithes, verse 26. Number 3. The Levite and the tithe, and that's Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 27. A. Remembrance of the Levite, and that's found in verse 27. B. Reason for remembrance of the Levite, and that's found also in verse 27. Number 4. Triennial collection of annual tithes, Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 28. A. Frequency for the presentation of tithes, verse 28. B. The site for the presentation of tithes is also verse 28. Number 5. Guidelines for the distribution of the tithes, Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 29. A. The recipients of tithes is found in verse 29. B. The purpose for the distribution of tithes is also found in verse 29. Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 22 to 29 contains the statement, "Thou shalt truly tithe." Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 22 contains this construction, and this literary feature implies that the local peasant farmer should present the tithes of crops and fruits annually. By emphasizing the idea of tithing yearly, Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 22 implies that the presentation of corn, wine, and oil is an annual duty. Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 23 suggests that a meal accompanied the presentation of tithes at the official shrine. Thus, "and thou shalt eat before the Lord thy God," suggests that the tithes of what is produced belongs to the one who presented the tithes. It is improbable that the offerer consumed all the tithes. Consequently, tithes became a source from which people who worked at these shrines obtained commodities for their material support. Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 27 introduces the third major subdivision in this passage. This section contains one verse, and it is an admonition on behavior toward Levites. This verse, in its present form, says not to neglect this person because he had no inheritance among the people, while Deuteronomy 14, verse 27 admonishes concern for the Levite. It does not provide guidance on how to care for the Levite. Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 27, however, states that the Levites were poor and without means for sustenance, and the literary context of this verse associates the distribution of grain, fruit, and livestock with charity toward the Levites. Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 29 is the final subdivision in this law. This verse lists the widow, stranger, and orphan as a group, and it indicates that 1 year out of 3, these individuals shared in the consumption of the tithe. Thus, Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 29 shows that 2 years out of 3, the offerer and officials who ministered at the local shrine consumed tithes of grains, fruit, and livestock, and that 1 year out of 3, the widow, stranger, and orphan received some public assistance from the biblical community. The application says, Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 22 through 29 invites us to become givers and to practice other forms of altruism. Why? 2 major reasons suggest themselves. 1, we need to remain in control of our material possessions. That is to say, if we are unwilling to give or to share, we need to find out why this is the case. In other words, if we are unwilling to share our material possessions, the question immediately arises, who owns whom? If giving is a constant struggle, perhaps something owns us and we do not own it. If it is so hard for us to share our money or other resources, maybe something has gone awry in our spiritual development. We should own possessions. Possessions should not own us. Number 2, we have a divine responsibility to care for those who cannot care for themselves. God has given the divine charge to assist those who are unable to care for themselves. Look at the text. Deuteronomy 14, verse 29 points out that the people should care for the widow, stranger, and orphan. These people comprised a category of weak, vulnerable people in ancient Israelite society. Therefore, God wanted the community to share their resources with them. Lesson illustration. God wants us to involve ourselves in philanthropic enterprises. He wants us to be unselfish. I once read a story about a father who liked to read. The story has it that one evening after dinner, he sat in his favorite chair and eagerly began to read his new book. Just as he was getting to the part of the book that was good, his 4-year-old daughter entered the room. You know how little girls are. In a very cute soprano voice, she said, "Papa, will you read me a story?" The father looked at the book, namely, his new book, and then he glanced at his daughter's book, Curious George Rides a Bike. After looking at his daughter's book, he said, "Sure, honey. Papa will read you a story. Let's see what Curious George is up to these days." Sharing with others means we are willing to give of ourselves to be a blessing to other people. God gave his son, and the son gave his life. Let's give of ourselves unselfishly. The questions for today's lesson. Number 1, financial provision is just one way that God provides for us. In what other areas does the Lord give provisions? In what ways can we give of these other things with which God blesses us? Number 2, is God looking for us simply to give, or is he also concerned with our attitude toward giving? Number 3, should we be concerned with being recognized for giving? Why or why not? Write down your answers. And God bless you, and thank you for joining me today.